Welcome, everyone. We're really excited to bring you Mighty Moves with Jill Lauren on Decodable Text and Nancy Eberhardt. She's going to talk to us about heart words, and I will be moderating for you, watching the chat box. So we'll go ahead and get started. Jill, do you want to introduce yourself? They know Nancy and I have been following, but it might be nice to hear a little bit about you and your background.
Certainly. First of all, thank you, both Nancy and Cheryl, for having me. Hello to everybody. It's always fun to talk to people about decodable text because I see it as one of the most critical components of a structured literacy lesson. And I've been teaching for 40 years. That's my decodable text closet behind me, cabinet. And then in the last 5 years or so, I decided to add to the canon of decodable text by writing Whole Phonics. So I recognize some names and of folks out there using Whole Phonics. So it's really nice to see you guys. And I'm excited to share some information about Lindsay's book.
Yay, thank you so much. So we'll start with move 4. Using decodable text instead of predictable text with beginning readers. It's really crucial to know the difference. Then we'll move on to 5, embrace a better approach to teaching sight words. We'll talk about how Sortagories practices phonics and leave plenty of time for questions and answers. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started.
Okay. So it's actually really nice to see some familiar faces. So I might be looking right at you, Lorraine, the whole time tonight. Oh, with a dog, even better. Okay. Yes. So basically, I'm going to start by sharing that it was so much fun for me to read Lindsay's chapter on decodable text because it reflected so much of what I've been doing as a teacher. I'm one of the lucky few, basically. Well, I've been teaching for 40 years, but I'm one of the lucky few who was trained really well in grad school. So, I've been doing this SOR approach for quite a while. And so it was really exciting to see her put together her thoughts about how to use decodable text in such a easy to read and accessible way. So what we're going to do tonight is talk about some of the highlights and let's move along. So Lindsay begins by talking about predictable text because it has been such a ubiquitous tool for the last 30 years in balanced literacy classrooms. And, when you're talking about the seismic shifting that's going on, the real question is like, well, what's so wrong with predictable text? So, we've all heard about the problems with the 3 queuing system, but Lindsay gets into it a little more deeply. And she shares that the beginning readers typically read predictable repetitive text by memorizing the pattern or guessing words from context and picture. And what's interesting is that it creates this illusion of reading. So that's what happens in kindergarten. The teachers often think, well, wow, they're reading. So unless you look closely, the student's inability to read is hidden from view. And so what she's actually stating quite clearly is the concerns regarding the 3 queuing model, which is that it is in fact based on a false idea of what reading was, because we know, at least many people who are here tonight know that, the brain requires a instruction with regards to the sounds of our spoken language, that's phonics, and that reading is not a series of strategic guessing informed by context clues. I mean, logically, you have to think about that. Well, what happens when they get to 3rd and 4th grade and they can't guess? I mean, then they're in trouble. And the additional point is that students need phonics knowledge so they can decode unknown words with a sound out strategy that will help all students break the code. And that's basically what phonics is doing. For anybody who's here tonight, any administrators who are like tuning in because they're trying to learn about the phonics, the science of reading and the role of phonics, we're going to show you like what that means when it comes to decodable text. So I think this is really important. Lindsay talks about, well, you won't know for 2 to 3 years, how poorly a child is performing based on what you might be witnessing in kindergarten. So in kindergarten with the repetitive, predictable text, wow, it might look like, hey, everything's great. But down the road, we really see what's happening. And I'm going to talk about the NAEP scores, but I'm first going to share, as Lindsay talks about in her book, that these habits that they start in kindergarten are really tough to break. And I actually just sat with a 4th grader at a school in the Bronx to see, why he's struggling as he is. And this kid even though he's been taught phonics, the number of times he was guessing, even though he could sound out the word, it is really a tough habit to break. So let's look at the most recent NAEP scores to see what happens when, you look down the road 2 to 3 years to see like, did they in fact learn how to read in kindergarten using these predictable readers? And the most recent NAEP scores from 2022, they're lower than 2019. Of course, we had COVID, but it's not by much. So you can see since 92, like just these scores have remained flat. But we keep talking about this notion of, well, only 1/3 of children are at a proficient level or above, meaning 2/3 are below proficient. And as you see here, 37% of 4th graders performed below NAEP basic. Okay, basic is below proficient. And then 28% of 4th graders were at NAEP basic, NAEP being the our nation's report card. But as I was reviewing this, I thought to myself, well, what does basic even mean? And that's the important piece. So when we're talking about basic, it means that it indicates partial mastery of fundamental skills. So what's a fundamental skill? Like an ability to decode. If you can't decode, how are you going to be able to comprehend? So this partial mastery is where we end up with so many kids and then adults having, issues with literacy. So I think it's important for us to understand what we even mean by the majority of kids who are reading at a basic or below level. That's just partial mastery of fundamental skills. That kind of made me, anyway, that was very hard to read, that definition. So let's just make sure before we move along, because we're going to get into talking about decodable text, what really is problematic about level text, even though so much of it is delightful. Like this book, I Went Walking, it's just delightful. But in terms of using it for teaching reading, it's problematic. So we're going to take a quick look inside. So this really adorable book, I Went Walking, you see the repetitive patterns. So once a child understands that the first picture is always I went walking, and we have these clues of actual movement, and that the next page is what did you see, then all they have to do is look at the animal. I saw a brown horse looking at me, and then I saw a red cow looking at me. The repetitive nature allows kids just to memorize a pattern without understanding the code, the written code, and learning what those letters actually say. So Lindsay strongly recommends, and I think this is, she says it, quite directly, set aside your guided levels A through D. And she doesn't say, abandon them. She just says set them aside. They should not be used to teach children how to read. And she's recommending that we use decodable books, decodable text instead. So we're going to talk tonight about some different examples of decodable text. But first we should really be asking ourselves, well, what is decodable text? So these are books that are designed to help students achieve mastery of phonics skills that they're learning. So as we said, and as the science has shown us, in order to become a good reader, we have to demystify the alphabetic principle of our written language and help children learn what that code is. So that's the whole purpose of decodable text. And in a well-designed decodable text, the majority of the words are phonetically regular. That means they follow the instructional code or the instructional scope and sequence that is part of that series. They contain letter sound correspondences that are consistent and can be sounded out because they contain phonics skills we teachers have taught. Okay, so our instruction drives a child's ability to either read or not read a decodable text. And then finally, decodable texts are the tool that allows targeted, purposeful practice of the phonics skills you are teaching. And this is important, I'll be saying it again later, they build a sense of success early on. So when you put a decodable text in front of a student, you are assuming, we're not assuming, you are sure that you have taught them the skills, the sounds needed to be able to read that text, along with any sight words that are part of that series. Okay, so let's look inside decodable text to talk a little bit more about this code, the phonics code. So, and this is actually something that Lindsay talks about quite strongly, that decodable texts are only decodable if you have taught the phonics skills featured in them. So if we put down, like, this is Zach's pal from Whole Phonics we start with short A, but there's a program I know that starts with short I. So if I follow the scope and sequence of that program, and then I put this verse book in front of a child, there's the likelihood that they will not succeed in reading it is great, because they haven't learned short A if I've only taught them short I based on another scope and sequence. So what you can see here is that in order to read the words, Zach is sad, Zach has no pal, we have the sounds to know, and it's very explicit. In order to read this book, here are the sounds you need. And then there's a number 3 to 5 high frequency words, usually per book. Well, in this book, there's 5, but they came before in the prior series, but it's usually 1 to 3 words per book, high frequency words, because we don't want to overload those need special attention, which Nancy will talk about as when she reviews the high frequency word component for move 4 later on. So that's what we mean by code to text match. And now this is just a further example. So here we've taught, in this book, we're teaching SH. So you can see the number of SH words that are part of this story. Oftentimes the text will focus on just one new target skill because they've got to apply it, they've got to learn it and apply it. And for a lot of kids, especially struggling or dyslexic readers, that may take many opportunities and a lot of repetition. And you'll also see that information that came in prior readers is also being reviewed, because we want to make sure that we keep going back and reviewing what was already taught to make sure that was solidified. So it's the phonics knowledge, as Lindsay writes, that a student brings to the text that determines whether it's decodable for them. And it's our responsibility as teachers to make sure our students have that knowledge. So in the next series, this is Express Readers, Elise Lovejoy's Express Readers. You see that in her step 5 readers, they're teaching the long vowel. This one is focusing on EA. So you see the number of EA words that are in this book, and the past sounds, short vowels. She had already taught EE and Magic E. Those are also are being reviewed in this series. And then this is the next slide shows you a list, a number of other what I consider high quality decodable texts. And all of them have pictures, colorful pictures and complete storylines. So the nice thing is there's more and more options out there. And for sure, as Lindsay says strongly, you need to align your decodable book collection to your phonics scope and sequence. So that's what we've been saying, like what your decodable text will reflect what you've been teaching, because it's the place that they're going to practice what you've taught. So for example, then this is from Phonic Books. This is the Magic Belt series, which is a real favorite, especially for boys, because there's a lot of like blood and guts in this series. But you can see their scope and sequence in the back of the book. You'll often find scope and sequence in the back of the book or the back cover or on a website. And so, for example, if you're teaching short vowel words, then you move to blends, adding ED, and then you go through the H digraphs with CK, then NG, and consonant LE. If that's the sequence that you're using, then this series is a great place for you to have your students apply that knowledge after you've taught them the various phonics skills. Another thing, as Lindsay keeps writing, scope and sequence matters, and you'll notice that most decodable text goes from simple to complex. The vowels, the short vowels are almost always taught first, and logically it would be because about half of our syllable types or syllables contain short vowels. So there's a lot of power in teaching the short vowels first. And then as you continue on to more complex concepts, oftentimes you'll see the complexity of the text increasing as well, because you want to keep going back to repeat the old, and that means the text has to become lengthier. So as we're reading, there's consistent review of the old concepts. And then, as I showed you in the other series as well, I'm just adding the importance of real storylines in these decodable texts and also multicultural representation. Both of them are equally important. When we're reading, we're teaching students that they should be reading for meaning. So if the storylines don't make sense, then we're in a sense teaching children that reading is just word calling. So we really want to make sure that when we're reading, we're asking questions, the story can evoke a conversation, that there's a problem to be solved, that children can connect with characters on some level. And in terms of connection with the characters, yes, multicultural representation is critical so that all children can see themselves in the books they read. And at present, only 10% of children's books contain images of children, Black or brown children, children of color. So that's a real, it's something important to consider. Who's your population? Do they see themselves in the books they're reading? Or do they see other children, maybe not the kids that they're going to school with, but so they get to meet other kids, maybe who are not exactly like them. So now, one of the most exciting things that has happened over the last year is that UFly, beloved UFly, aligned their scope and sequence with a whole bunch of decodable text and sortagories. So you can see that sortagories now is aligned with UFly, which is very exciting. Whole Phonics has been aligned, but there's a whole bunch of decodable text aligned with the UFly scope and sequence. And it provides opportunities for teachers when they're looking for, well, I'm teaching Short E, what can I use as a place to practice the Short E? UFly's put together a really nice scope and sequence and has connected a number of different decodable text options. So what you'll see is as you become adept at teaching phonics, you will develop a scope and sequence in your mind as to what you think is most effective for your kids. And in time, you'll be able to open up any decodable text and look at it and think, oh, this is great. This is going to work at this level for this group that I'm teaching. That's how much a part of your teaching mindset the scope and sequence will become. So that's why Lindsay says the more you understand about phonics concepts, the better you'll understand decodable texts, because they are created to represent phonics concepts. And again, when we put books in front of students that, hold on one second, I'm just going to stick with
You
that.
said and.
Yeah, sorry, that was the key word. Anyway, when you put books in front of students that you've taught them the code for, that is a place where they're now going to feel empowered and able to read. And once you're able to do that, then boy, then you become excited about reading. So the other piece is, and this is what I love about UFly, they give us so many different options. And of course, you know, students need choices. You don't want to just have one set of decodable books because, you know, some kids may not like those books. So, you know, a couple options, just like we as adults like to go to the bookstore to consider our options, or the library, kids need options too. And so at what point in the lesson do we teach with decodable text? And this goes back to the move, I think it's number 3, the phonics move that was taught last week. And you'll see this is Lindsay's suggestion. Of course, we're reviewing the old, we teach the new, that's number 2. We do a phonemic awareness warm-up. We introduce our new phonics concept, or we go back and review depending on where we're at. We read the words with that new concept. We can do dictation. That can be flexible before or after, or sometimes we just read the words and we jump right into the decodable text. And then Lindsay's suggesting that in smaller groups, we provide extended practice and read more connected text, whether it's decodable or authentic. And that would have to do with whether or not your students are really ready for authentic text. So it's nice to see that she's got decodable text in that lineup. Okay, so let's just talk for a moment about what small group instruction looks like. Because more and more schools are keying in to the importance of small group instruction, because it allows a teacher to teach the phonetic element that a small group of kids might need. So we know that children learn at various paces. So some kids, you know, even in kindergarten may come in already knowing short vowels and reading CVC words. So we don't want to hold them back. We want to get them moving, while another group of kids really may need to learn how to blend. So your small groups allow for targeted instruction of the phonetic element prior to reading. And then in a small group, you're better able to provide corrective feedback. Certainly, as children are reading aloud, that's the role of the teacher, is to listen carefully and correct them, try to break a problem before it really becomes a problem that is repeated. And then, as I've said many times, decodable text, or any text, any books, the goal is to read for meaning. So in small groups, you can be asking comprehension questions during or after. You engage kids in a conversation about the book. That's an enhancement of oral language. That's a wonderful time to have children also learn to listen to each other. You know, we're becoming more and more focused on like isolated tasks, like spending time alone on screen. So this is a chance for children to learn, how do you listen? How do you hear what your you know, your peer, your neighbor in the group is saying, and then maybe add on, comment on it. So there's a lot of important reasons to read in small group instruction. And the last one is that at the end of your small group instruction, you can send books home for rereading, which builds automaticity and orthographic mapping. But the nice thing is, if you've read those books in a small group, you'll know that that book is ready to go home. So you're not just sending something home that could be an exercise in frustration for a student. Another topic that Lindsay talks about is the use of various types of text. Now, for quite a while, children, excuse me, may only be able to read decodable text. So it would be the teacher's job and joy to read to the kids some of many other books that are out there, whether it's trade books, reading aloud, or in fact, chapter books. One moment, please. That random choking thing that happens. How many people have that random choking thing? Anyway, let's move on, because it's important, as I'm saying, to make sure that you're reading aloud to your students, because you want to make sure that they're hearing complex grammar, advanced vocabulary, grammar and vocabulary that they may not be hearing in the decodable text. And just a nod to some favorite picture books and chapter books. I asked the Whole Phonics team to share their favorite books, and this is what we came up with. Mine is Ferdinand. I love Ferdinand. He's like the peace-loving bull. So, reading above grade level, as Lindsay tells us, enhances vocabulary and exposes children to complex grammatical language structures. And one other place that I wanted to talk about is the importance, in the next slide, of discussing background knowledge. And I don't know how many people know that Whole Phonics has teamed up with ReadWorks, which was actually a brilliant idea that Nancy had. And we've aligned our level 1 decodable text with articles related to the animal kingdom. And so there's free decodable text on ReadWorks website. 5 of our 15 readers are free. And then there's wonderful activities through these articles. The teacher reads the articles to the students because, again, they're above their reading level, but at least we're still building background knowledge. They're hearing new vocabulary, they're hearing complex grammar. And then the second book, as you'll see, that where it says step reads, number 2, every book has a step reads article. And that article is a more decodable version of the first book. So where it says a pig in his wig, the first article says pigs. And then the second article says step read pigs. That's a more decodable article. And I've seen this with students I've worked with, where I'll read the article to them and then I'll ask them to read the step reads, and they're surprising me by reading words that I would not have thought that they could read, but they heard those words repeatedly in when I read the article to them, the more advanced article. And that's just a wonderful example of set for variability. And then I know we're getting close on timing. Nancy, I'm watching the timing, but I want to talk. Okay, good. I want to talk about how Lindsay discusses this transition from decodable to authentic text. And truly, decodables should be used for a limited amount of time, similar to training wheels. I mean, I have to say, sadly, I'm hearing about school districts that are saying, K2 only decodable text. But I'm sure there's kids in those grades who can read. I can read books, for example. So we have to have all of those options ready to go as soon as they start to crack the code, because we want them applying their phonics knowledge in more authentic text, because that's the ultimate goal. So yes, they should be used for a limited amount of time, and you should transition students out of them as soon as they have the essential skills needed to read authentic text. Now, in Lindsay's chapter, on the next slide, she quotes Linda Farrell and Michael Hunter's guidelines to when you should consider moving your students out of decodable text, which she notes is not an exact science. But exactly what I'm about to read to you is the pattern that I can tell you I've used for 40 years, and it's a great guideline. So that students should be able to read real and nonsense, CVC, 3 CVC words with blends with short vowels. So short vowels, digraphs, consonant clusters in isolation. So we know that reading in isolation, that's like the purest form of seeing whether or not kids can really apply their phonics skills, especially with nonsense words. then an ability to read two-syllable real words like comment and napkin, and familiar three-syllable words like fantastic, penmanship, and in isolation, words that contain the syllables with the schwa, closed syllables or schwa, like trumpet, for example, or cactus. So that's another sign. And then the third one, the third skill, that they can decode 1 and 2 syllable real words with R controlled vowels and silent E. So that's once those are covered, that's when I'm like, okay, are we ready? Are we ready? And then I have these next books teed up to see if in fact they are. The two on the right are my favorite, both the Frog and Toad series and the Fox series by James Marshall. Frog and Toad is super sweet and funny. Fox is just a riot. These I Can Read books are a wonderful place to see, like, hey, are you ready for more advanced, authentic text? And you'll see your students, once they've covered all those skills, reading words that you thought, whoa, I didn't know you could do this. But that's that, again, that concept of set for variability, just enough phonics knowledge, and it can take them farther than you may have expected. But that's not to say they won't still need explicit instruction for certain phonics skills, even though they are able to transition. Just watch, and in fact, use these books to watch and see, like, when they're making mistakes and they can't sound out, that could be the very place where you're like, oh, looks like I need to teach that phonetic element because they have no clue how to read that word. You use these books now for your diagnostic teaching to see, where are they stuck? And then there's just one topic I felt like we should just cover very briefly. So I keep getting emails about AI generated decodable text, which could ultimately be exciting. So I tried out a program. This is Objective 9, learning the sound D, and all the rest of the letters, all the rest of the sounds came prior. So I'm going to read it. It's Nat had a pet. It is a tot. Nat did pat the tot. The tot did nap on a mat. I can't even read it because it doesn't make sense. Nat and the tot are not sad. Just, again, I can't stress enough, decodable text should be for obtaining meaning, and we want children to understand that what they read has to make sense. So while this is new technology, and maybe it's going to be something wonderful, I would just say for now, since it's so new, just be careful about what you put in front of your students. And I look forward to talking to people at the end if there's any questions. But for now, get ready to hear Nancy discuss heart words. And
no. We want to take a
words.
moment and take some questions. Are there any questions or anything, Cheryl? Maybe we should not pile on more information before we give folks a chance to get some answers.
Well, first I want to acknowledge David's comment. He said alignment and mass practice for decodable is so important. I just want to agree with him on that. And Jill did a nice job reiterating and putting in her own spin on that. So that was really appreciated. Also, he said he loved the Whole Phonics books. Kids love them, and I would agree with that. My own family members and students in my district also love them. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Allison, sorry. Allison is asking a question, and it's specific for 95% group, but I almost want to substitute it with any groups. But the question is, or the comment, we're using 95% group. So I was wondering if there were decodables aligned to their scope and sequence. If not, I guess I could look at UFly. So what if you're using a particular company and you're looking for alignment? Do you have suggestions for that?
Yes. So I would say the quick and easy place is UFly, even though in some regards, even their alignment, like they've aligned our books based on the most common use of a certain phonetic element. Like in one book, we have a lot of ED words, but it's really all about the L blends. So those books come under ED, but they should come under L blends. I think it goes back to what Lindsay's suggesting about know your phonics scope and sequence. And you can ask any company to send you their scope and sequence, and they should. And so then you can look to see, do those scope and sequences, sequenci align? Any company should send you their scope and sequence. It's a public service because you're looking for books to align with your instruction.
Jill, along
Right.
that line, oh, excuse me, Cheryl.
No, go ahead.
Along those lines, I was thinking as you were talking earlier, if it's not 100% perfect alignment, is there an amount that makes sense, a percentage that you're looking for? Because some, the UFI list is amazing as a resource, but it isn't 100%. So how do you deal with that?
So a couple things. Let's just say this. Let's say that, one company, or one program teaches 3 of the L blends, but your book has 5 L blends. Like, that's not such a big deal. But if the vowel instruction, the short vowel instruction is off, that's a big deal. So I like, here's a good example. There's a district in Texas that told me that they taught short I first, then short A, based on a program, based on training they had in Texas. And we just said, well, how hard would it be to flip it? Just do short A, then short I. And they're like, not hard at all. Oftentimes it's easier to realign the instruction of the program than try to figure out how to manipulate the decodable text. Because when you think about, and as you become more and more adept at phonics instruction, you'll see that there's a pattern, like you saw the steps on Lindsay's lesson plan. You introduce your phonics, your new sound. You read it in words, you read it in decodable text, you do your dictation. So to be able to be adept at adjusting, it's like, I just have to say, like, I don't use a teacher's manual, and this is way before Whole Phonics. Like, I just used my decodable text, and I knew like the scope and sequence that I want in my head, like short vowels first, because they're so powerful, and then CK, and because now we're building words, double Z, L, F, and S, the H digraphs, because we're still building words. So if you can be a little adept at making some small adjustments without it being overwhelming, that's another suggestion.
All right.
Thank you. I think that's helpful. And I know that when in doubt, I always leaned into the short vowels. So I felt like other things, especially for older kids, because they were probably already at least introduced to those other sounds, but they're having trouble with short vowels. I would have a crate, and I'd have different decodable text companies, and they would be, all the different companies would be mixed up in my crate, which makes some people a little bit crazy because they want all their companies together. But instructionally, you really want like your short vowels together, your blends together,
Yes.
And so mix those companies up in your crates, folks. It doesn't have to look pretty. It doesn't have to be all aligned.
It's called going sideways. Like, you may need
Right?
6 books with a short E for that
Right.
particular student. So
right. So that is my suggestion. There's one more question here. Arca's saying, when making a note and gist or summary from a passage or a story, how decoding of text is important in order to get the main point. Sorry, this thing is in my way. Words and ideas, core essentials are important of the decodable, importance of whole passage and decoding them in short, precise. I guess the question here is, are we doing it in a short, precise, and brief form? How are we making the note of the gist or the summary? And if I'm not getting that right, feel free to unmute yourself and ask it a different way.
I'd love to understand the question.
Making the note and gist.
So I can just say that
Somebody talking?
yeah, in the Whole Phonics decodable text, there's a summary. Is she talking? Is someone talking? Okay, there's a summary in the front of the jacket, which is meant for teachers to be able to read with ease as they move into the story. Like when we when we put a new book in front of students, and actually Lorraine knows this, the first thing that we do is look at the cover and we look at the title and we start to talk about what could the problem of the story be. So we alert them right away, like, yeah, we're little reading detectives. We're going to find out what's the problem, because most stories have a problem, and kids love that. They love trying to psych out what could this be about, what could be the solution to the problem. That makes them super engaged readers. So I hope that's sort of answering the question.
Thank you.
All right. Well, maybe we should now move on to move number 5. And that is embrace a better approach to teaching sight words. And there were 3 things that Lindsay said in the chapter that made me write questions like, what is a better approach to teaching sight words? I didn't know that maybe we weren't doing the better way. Are sight words the same as high frequency words? She spent quite a bit of time sorting out the terminology, which I thought she did a really wonderful job of. And then what should instruction look like? And I would just like to make a comment that I, over the course of my career, which is even longer than Jill's, I started out with words that were high frequency, which is a whole nother topic in and of itself. But I started by having kids trace those words over and over on paper, what used to be called the Grace Fernald method. And you would trace it and say the letters and do this over and over and over again. And when I was reading Lindsay's chapter, I was feeling somewhat remorseful that I did that, because we know better now and have a different way we should be thinking about what we're doing. So with that being said, and I'm now admitting to my errors of my ways, I'd like to talk for a moment about this better approach. Builds on the processing of orthographically mapping words. Whoops, I have this fluky little thing with this. And this image is from Carolyn Strom's fabulous webinar, and hopefully we can put that in somewhere in the minutes or the notes that Cheryl sends out, at least the reference. But what Carolyn is reminding us, and anyone who is looking at the reading brain imaging, is saying that we're going to hook together the sounds b, a, t, with the letters that represent those sounds, the B, the A, and the T. But it's really important that it hooks up with the meaning. And I think Jill mentioned this over and over. We don't want kids just, saying the words. We want them to hook this up to meaning. But it is not just doing the part of the sound hooking to the letters that is learning the words, but it is tying it to the meaning. And that is when we have a word orthographically mapped. And this becomes really relevant in a moment when we talk about those high frequency words and how they overlap with this topic of sight words. So anyway, I love this image. It just makes it so concrete what we're trying to do to orthographically map words. So I have a question. Which of these words are sight words? I'm sure that we would have some different answers here, but in fact, as Jan Wasowitz says, every word wants to be a sight word when it grows up. And I think what Lindsay clarified really beautifully in the book is that a sight word is any word that we have orthographically mapped. It doesn't matter whether the letters follow a phonics scope and sequence, or they're irregular words, or they're high frequency words. Any word is a sight word. So we need to be sure that we're all calling sight words the same thing. We're using the terminology correctly, or at least consistently. But, and this is where we do kind of overlap. I think that the words on the left, said and the, some of you might have thought those were the sight words, because those words also overlap the high frequency word list, like that 100 or 200 words that occur so frequently in print. We want to have kids learn them early on because they cover and help them read so many more words in print. So the fact of the matter is that all of these words are sight words. The words on the left, said and the, are also high frequency sight words. And we want to try to orthographically map these words too, which is why we are seeing more and more emphasis on using the same segmenting technique, the same mapping of letters to sound or sounds to the letters that we do with these irregular words. And for some, they're referring to this as heart words, and the part that you need to memorize by heart is you put a heart over it. There are different ways we're working on this, but the fact is we are still wanting students to go s, e, d, and that they're still hearing 3 sounds. And that is part of the process of locking this word into memory for good. And then the words on the right will become sight words, but we'll be using the kind of phonics skills that Pam talked to us about last week and Jill was talking about with us this week. The other thing that really jumped out to me was the point that Lindsay was making. Whoops, oh my goodness, this little crazy. That many high frequency words are challenging because the meaning doesn't make sense without context. And I really believe this is another reason we have to get kids into decodable text where these high frequency words are also occurring, because they have to be in context, and words by themselves in isolation are not in context. But I was curious and loved that Lindsay put the first thing on her list to teach irregular words was to say the word and use it in a sentence to establish the meaning in a context. I think I have a typo in there. I apologize. And I love that because, in fact, one of the practices that we would like to and probably should encourage teachers to set aside is memorizing the high frequency words in isolation. And Cheryl and I had the pleasure of doing a webinar a year or so ago with both with Nancy Hennessy and also with Linda Farrell and Michael Hunter. And we were talking about these words in our language that are called cohesive devices, those words that are the mortar words that hold our language together. And I wanted to take a little departure from sortagory straight up here to just go back and look at this, because of that first 100 words, and this goes to Lindsay's point as well, if we sorted those first 100 words into, just a minute, I'm going to keep going back here. Cohesive ties, those are pronouns, and connectives, prepositions, conjunctions, and adverbs. Some of them need to be learned as heart words, or some part is a heart part. But many of them are just little decodable words like it and in and. But we need to put these words into context for us to really know what they mean. So what I'm suggesting is putting these words on flashcards and practicing in and whatever by themselves is not a good use of instructional time. And in fact, as an example, let's see the impact. Here's a little passage from Flyleaf. If we highlight the words that are the high frequency words and then take them out because we're misreading them, look at, can you understand this? Probably not, because those little words, either missing or misread, are going to significantly impact the meaning. So if we go back and even presented, let me go, now I can't go back, even presented within a big glass bowl, at least we are providing a context, which is part of what actually segues into what Cheryl and I tried to do with sortagory. So I just want to make the point that Lindsay's suggestion for instruction to put these high frequency words into context is really huge. So where does sortagories work on the heart words or the high frequency words? We do that in our row 1 because we are doing phonemic analysis. We are hooking the letters, or the sounds rather, to the letters. And so that is the logical place. But based on what I was just saying, the less logical, but the actual necessary place to also work on the heart words is in where we generalize and put them into phrases, where we're now working on these high frequency words where they have a context, where we are practicing them with other words that help give them meaning. And that will help kids orthographically map and learn those words. So, as I say, we do a lot of the segmentation work in Map It, and that, just as a review, we've seen this several times before. If I said the word that, it would be the at, and I would tap the boxes. And then the corrective feedback, whether it's right or wrong, the student will see is the representation of the letters for the sounds. And in sortagories, we use a yellow heart to represent sounds that eventually kids will learn in the scope and sequence, but may not know in the first module, which is where we use this. But it's different than a sound that will never become regular. And this is the example of the high frequency words that we use in the first module. And you can see that we have 5 words, and these get used. But notice with said that AI will always be irregular because there aren't other words with AI saying ah. And then, as I suggested, we move to that we built sortagories to move those heart words into the phrase building in that last row of our activities, where we're putting the words into context. And the reason for that is we want kids to see those words that mean nothing by themselves with other words at the phrase level. And in sortagories, we do have a heart word glossary, which I'm going to just show you because I think it explains it better than I can.
Hearts let you know which part of the word is tricky. The heart part needs to be memorized. The rest of the word can be decoded using your knowledge of letters that represent sounds. A yellow heart means you'll learn the way the sound is spelled later. A red heart means you'll need to memorize the sound's spelling by heart. Click Next to view words that have heart sounds in level A.
So again, going along with the point we were making about scope and sequence, your scope and sequence in your books might be a little different than the words we've used, but I think this idea can be applied on your own if there are a few words that don't overlap. So the heart words we've used are these in alphabetical order. And if you click on a word,
the letter E spells E in he.
And eventually they're going to learn that E at the end of a syllable is a long E, but right now they don't know that. So if I want to use that in level A, where we're only doing short vowels, we need to teach this in a somewhat different way. And then we have a whole slew of words that we use that have TH in them. And by the time they work on these, they're going to know the or the by the time they get to the digraph TH in our level B of sortagories. And that just continues on. So, and then I should say, I think we're coming near to the end. So coming back to each time we end our session, we come back to our word knowledge network. And I think the added dimension, in addition to the phonics, the sound to spelling correspondence for those patterns that are regular, is we think we can apply that same process to the sight words, to these high frequency words, or the sight words, which is really the more global term. But I want to add that adding this meaning component, this syntactic component to learning these words that are basically abstractions, unless they have other words, is really an important part of whether you're using sortagories or whole phonics or anything. That is a very important part of your instructional process. So we're back to our rope. We're continuing to foster this. We can be doing decoding and language comprehension at the same time. And it, as Jill said, even when you're working on decodable text, we want to be reading informational text and text that's at a higher level to be building up that language comprehension. So we end up with kids who are good readers and comprehenders. And that brings us to the end of this session. Happy to answer some questions, but we're looking forward to coming back next week to look more closely at fluency and comprehension with Dale Webster. So any questions?
We see lots of thank yous in the chat. Folks are asking about the notes. I will send those via email to those who registered. You'll get the recording and a couple things that we mentioned here. If there's any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or just unmute yourself and speak freely.
I'm going to move forward so we get to this information in case anybody wants to reach out.
I want to thank Jill. Oh, more accolades. Thanks, Jen. I want to thank Jill for being with us and adding her expertise about decodable text. There is a question from Melissa: how accurate is the U5 scope and sequence with how we should teach with the science of reading in mind? Gosh, I think I don't think anyone is doubting the scope and sequence for U5. That's my 2 cents, but I'll let Nancy and Jill chime into that.
I would agree with you, Cheryl. I think they do the things that Jill mentioned, which is they go from the most common to the less common, and they go from the less complex or the simple to the more complex. And I think, could that be rearranged slightly? Yes, but when you follow those principles, you end up pretty much with that order. So I would say that they did a really good job, better than really good.
Yeah.
Jill, up over to you.
No, and you know, teachers are excited about it. So I think it's helpful for teachers. And I, like I said earlier, I do believe that the more and more teachers understand the importance of a scope and sequence, and the more they live with a scope and sequence, they'll be able to make the adjustments independently.
Right. So the question in further is, I want to confirm that the order is accurate as part of best practices. So there isn't a best scope and sequence out there. I think it's important to be systematic and sequential in the scope and sequence.
And then to do the lesson plan that keeps layering different kinds of practice with that scope and sequence so that kids master it, they acquire it. And that leads me to, just since we have the opportunity with Jill and Cheryl and myself here all at the same time, if you are going to be at IDA in Columbus, Ohio in a few weeks, we would welcome you to join us for the Regina Gooden Structured Literacy Symposium, where a lot of the reasons why scope and sequence and decodable text and so on are important is for the kinds of practice that it provides to children so that they learn. We're trying to put some emphasis not just on what we're teaching, which is of course the importance of a scope and sequence, but also how we're teaching it, and that we need to titrate the amount and the type of practice that certain children need. And we need to link that up with good use of data and good instructional practice. So if you're in Columbus, please join us. If not, you'll get to read all about it in the next issue of Perspectives that's coming out from IDA. Should be out this week on through their digital platform. So please.
Great. Another question, is there a way to access past recordings? Yes, they will also be in the show notes. You can also find them on Sortagory's YouTube channel. I'm pretty sure I created a playlist for them. If I didn't, I will be, but I think there's a playlist just for these. There's a couple more questions. I want to make sure I hit them. Let me see. Past recordings. Is there a free version of Sortagory's? Not exactly. There are try-its. The best way to try Sortagory's is on our website and go to the try it link, and you can try every activity in Sortagory's. 3 or 4 examples in each activity can be tried. And then
Vowels
also
A
there's
and B.
for A and B, and there's also videos to watch it, but there is not a free version. Sorry about that. Let's see. This is a comment. I love this. This is Eileen. I have ordered many different publishers' decodables and have organized them according to the Phonetic Program Foundation's. Lots of work, but worth it. And yes, that's what I guess I was trying to say too. It is a lot of work, and it might look a little messy, but it is worth it. And you will just find you have this huge toolbox now of decodable text in a sequence that makes sense to you or will make sense. Like Jill said, it'll just start making sense the more you work with them in your brain, and you won't have to look so much up. But very good. I think we've covered the questions. Tuning in for Australia. I love that. Thank you. Oh, another textual meaning is only limited to a particular text and may be varied with different contexts, and different context meaning will be different. Just a comment there. Great webinar. Love Whole Phonics, Express Readers, and Sortagory's. Thanks, Meg. I love all those too. All good people. We appreciate those comments, and we appreciate you being here. Someone else, what strategies? Oh, here's another one. What strategies need to be implemented in order to get effective results and output and getting benefit from the reading along with comprehensible reading?
That's a big one.
That's a whole webinar, right?
Yes, isn't next, what's Dale Webster doing? Fluency?
Yeah, I was just gonna say,
I think
I
that will be part of the next one. That's a good point, because that's really where we're going. That's a good answer to that. I definitely would tune in next time.
and we're not just saying that either, but I think
no, for real. That's the topic.
But for real. But the other thing I would say, I would encourage anyone has Lindsay's book, and I'm hoping that those of you who are here, that's why you're here, as you do, is to look at her lesson plan, which I think reflects the practices that need to be done both individually and collectively to get to comprehensible reading and writing. And I think one of the reasons that I like the extent to which Lindsay has utilized a lesson plan, I know Jill emphasizes this in using the decodable books she's written, and we're going to talk about this in Columbus, is when we pick and choose the steps we do in that lesson, we are it's like cutting a little bit off of one leg of a table. It's making it a little lopsided. And I think that those practices all contribute to orthographic mapping, and then all the other skills that follow from knowing how to read the words automatically and accurately. So and then I do think next week we will be getting into that question a little bit more. So thank you for that. That's teeing us up great.
That's right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.